introduce you, and then you guys can come on up. Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm glad to see so many folks out here today to have Elizabeth Hassrick, Steve Raudenbush, and Lisa Rosen discuss the contents of their new and fantastic book, The Ambitious Elementary School. It is a fantastic read, and I recommend it to all of you here in audience in person, and also to all the folks streaming this on the internet live. This book is a fascinating catalog of two charter schools and how they have designed an elementary school both to achieve ambitious student outcomes, but also an ambitious design that really breaks from some of the normal expectations of what we expect for elementary school functions. And it's going to be a great presentation. I want to briefly just do a few things on housekeeping and do some introductions for our authors and cover a few other housekeeping items. Let's see. The run of show is fairly simple. We'll have a presentation for about 30 minutes by the authors, and then we'll bring up a fantastic panel who I will introduce later, but we have, just to give you a quick rundown, we have McGhee Hassrick from Digital Pioneers Academy. We have Principal Melissa Brunson, who I am very appreciative, making it all the way to AEI after a full day of work at Cloverly Elementary School in Montgomery County, Maryland. And we also have Bob Slavin from Johns Hopkins University of Success for All fame and his many other works. So we have a great panel to discuss the book today. For those of you who use Twitter, we have a hashtag for the event. That's hashtag AmbitiousLM, E-L-E-M. Please use that if you're tweeting about it, and especially during the Q&A time. If you tweet questions to me or with that hashtag, I will try and monitor that. So you can participate directly in the Q&A. Please follow along. Again, the hashtag is hashtag AmbitiousJustLM. One other note, we have lots of events here at AEI, and our next education event is on June 22nd. We'll have Senator Chuck Grassley here on criminal justice reform. You can check aei.org for details and RSVP on that. So if you will please silence your cell phones, I'll introduce our authors today. Lisa Rosen is going to step up first and present here. She's from the University of Chicago and is the executive director of the University of Chicago Science of Learning Center, and she directs the Successful Pathways from School to Work program there. She's previously worked at the Urban Education Institute and has done research on social and cultural dimensions of school effectiveness and organization. Elizabeth McGhee Hassrick came down from Drexel today, where she works at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute. She's an assistant professor with the Life Course Outcomes Research Program there. She's also held faculty positions at the University of Chicago and the Weill Cornell Graduate School of Medical Sciences. Before that, she spent a decade in the classroom, so we'll be happy to hear her perspective. And then finally, Steve Raudenbush from the University of Chicago. Steve's the Lewis Sebring Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Sociology and the chairman of the Committee on Education at the University of Chicago. Excuse me for reading it. It's hard to remember that long of a title. Steve is interested in a great deal of work, has a great body of work behind him, particularly his interest in statistical models and how they apply to schooling. He's best known for his work in the development of hierarchical linear models. I was able to teach 3 years of HLM in graduate school as a TA using Steve's other textbook. So this is the second most important Steve Raudenbush book in my history. And of course, Steve has a great body of work that has led AERA to give him the award for distinguished contributions to educational research. So we're very glad to have them here, and Lisa's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Nat, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking time out on this very hot afternoon to be with us to learn about our book, The Ambitious Elementary School. I'm going to make sure I got this right. There we go. So there's the title, there's the cover. We hope you'll read it. The book is going to give you, our talk today is going to give you just a flavor of the big ideas, but there are lots of ideas in the book and lots of details we're going to leave out, so we do hope that you'll buy it, read it, and we can continue the conversation on Twitter and elsewhere. Our book is rooted in a debate and a paradox. The debate is over how much schools can do to reduce inequality in educational achievement. There are some who say that you have to fix poverty before we can eliminate the achievement gap between high and low SES background students, students from high and low socioeconomic status backgrounds. On the other side of the debate are those who point to a significant body of research, which we review in the book, that provides strong evidence that schools can, in fact, educate disadvantaged students to high levels by increasing both the quantity and quality of instruction that students receive. Examples of increasing quantity include efforts to increase instructional time in various ways and expand access to high-quality preschool. And increasing instructional time can include things like extending the school day, extending the school year, summer school, expanding access, like I said, to high-quality early childhood education. Examples of increasing quality include efforts to improve teacher knowledge and skill, provide more objective evidence to inform instruction, and reduce class size, among other things. The paradox is that despite evidence from quite a number of these discrete interventions, which we know to be effective in certain contexts, the whole has failed to exceed the sum of its parts. Decades of school reform have failed to produce schools that reliably educate disadvantaged students to high levels. We argue in the book that the reason is a failure to account for schools as organizations. Intervening to improve teaching and learning is not like plugging a new appliance into an electrical outlet. There we go. Should have done that earlier. Rather, any new program, technique, curriculum, or practice needs to be purposefully integrated within an overall system of instruction that can provide a coherent and coordinated learning experience for students. This, in turn, requires accounting for the tremendous heterogeneity of both student skill and also teacher expertise. So in the book, so what we argue is that a major obstacle to effective school reform is what we call the private autonomous model of school organization. This is characterized by privatized instructional practice, where there's significant autonomy for teachers, but very little pedagogical guidance, and an underlying tacit conception of teaching as an idiosyncratic craft that springs from a teacher's personality and passion as opposed to a shared professional practice. We argue that if schools are going to be able to take advantage of what we know from research, from the studies that we review in Chapter 2 about those interventions that can, for example, improve student outcomes, schools, if they're going to be able to take advantage of this knowledge, they need to be organized to embrace and sustain powerful systems of instruction. And this, in turn, necessitates transforming the core work of teaching and school organization in fundamental ways. Our book presents a study of one school, the University of Chicago Charter School, and its 2 elementary campuses, that attempted this purposeful integration via a concerted effort to enact a coherent model of elementary schooling rooted in knowledge about learning, teaching, and school organization that was derived from both scholarly research and also expert practice. The school's 2 elementary campuses are located near the University of Chicago on the school's south side and serve a predominantly low-income African-American student population. We knew that the school's designers had sought to integrate the best available research on reading, math, and school organization, and had worked for years to develop and refine a coherent school model based on this research. So we launched a research project that aimed to make the model explicit and test its impact on students. Over a period of 5 years, from 2008 to 2012, we interviewed school leaders, teachers, and social workers at the 2 campuses to clarify the aims and design of their practice. We gathered documents and visited classrooms to discover visible traces of the model in practice, and we used the random assignment of students by means of an annual lottery to evaluate the impact of the school on reading and math achievement. Elizabeth is going to give you an overview of the model and its implications for instruction and school organization. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history, briefly, that led to its development, and that's the focus of Chapter 3 of our book. So here's the book is organized into 3 parts, and the first part goes through the research that I just mentioned, and the Chapter 3 really goes in more detail into the history. But the history starts with the Center for School Improvement, or CSI, which was established in 1987 by Anthony Breich, Sharon Greenberg, and Sarah Spurlark. In the early 1990s, CSI launched an initiative in a small network of very low-achieving Chicago public schools serving very disadvantaged students, focused on ambitious literacy learning. They tried to reorganize many aspects of school practice to support this learning. For example, they asked schools to establish a new role for a school-based literacy coordinator to support teacher learning and to free this person from classroom responsibilities so she could focus on whole school improvement. They also encouraged schools to carefully assess every child and teachers to talk with one another about student learning and the evidence of student learning in their classrooms. They had partial success in many schools where they worked, yet they also encountered persistent obstacles. The first of these were barriers to extending time for both student and teacher learning. At this time, Chicago Public Schools had one of the shortest school days in the nation, and a pervasive closed campus policy that resulted in school days that typically ended at 2:30 p.m. with no time built in for teachers to meet and talk, and very little opportunity for extended time for student learning in response to address the specific needs of students who were struggling. The second kind of barriers were more normative, and these were barriers to sharing expertise among teachers that stemmed from this craft conception of teaching I mentioned earlier. If you conceptualize teaching as an individual craft that stems from who you are as a person and sort of your passions and your individual personality, then it becomes hard to distinguish more or less expert teachers. It becomes critique of practice becomes critique of the person, and egalitarianism as a norm prevails. It becomes more difficult to distinguish more or less expert teachers if everybody's doing something different in their own classroom. So this craft conception led to a reticence about allowing more expert others into your classroom. So teachers in the schools where they worked were sometimes reticent, often reticent, to let these new literacy experts into their classrooms to observe instruction and to receive the feedback. And the university didn't actually have any authority to require this. And so there were barriers related to this kind of hesitation and these normative conceptions of what teaching is. In addition, authoritarian leadership tended to prevail in these schools, which served populations of students often in disorganized neighborhoods, somewhat disorganized neighborhoods where there was focus on order and control in the building. And so teachers were sometimes, authoritarian leadership prevailed, and teachers feared being observed by others, especially the principal. In addition, there was a sense of resignation in some of these places about the possibility that very disadvantaged students could actually achieve at high levels and engage the ambitious intellectual work that the university was asking schools to engage. And finally, the university lacked authority to alter any of these conditions. So they worked in schools at the pleasure of the principal, and the principal could decide at any time, this isn't working. And so they ultimately concluded that they needed to establish a new school where these barriers did not hold. And Elizabeth's going to tell you about the model they developed.
So in the book, we summarize the organizing principles of the model and their implications for instruction and school organization. We begin with the analysis of the root causes of inequality in achievement. I think I'm here on this slide. In the experiences and interactions that children have with adults way before they start school. So for example, in literacy, exposure to academic vocabulary, extended conversations about books, and oral storytelling develop the foundational higher order thinking skills that are necessary for reading comprehension. Similarly, playing with toys and puzzles, especially those that generate discussions about numerical and spatial relations, build a foundation for later mathematical problem solving, and they convey early advantages for the children who have these kinds of experiences. However, much research suggests that schools serving large numbers of low-income primary grade students tend to focus solely on more basic skills like decoding texts, memorizing math facts, solving routine problems. While basic skills are essential for academic success, they are not sufficient. Also essential are children's oral language skills, their vocabulary, their general knowledge, which is required for later comprehension of dense texts and for successfully applying complex math concepts to solve difficult problems. Unfortunately, we don't catch these gaps in kids' skills until later, around third grade, and that's when we test them. And we start testing them for reading comprehension and asking them to apply their knowledge in math. By contrast, the instruction we observed at the University of Chicago Charter School was rooted in a developmental theory of how children learn essential skills and concepts in both reading and mathematics, a theory that accounts for the way in which later higher order thinking skills emerge and certain kinds of intellectual experiences children have early on. This theory suggests that to close gaps, schools must teach phonics and math facts during the early years and also simultaneously develop a foundation for more advanced skills. They must do both in tandem right from the very beginning. Theory suggests that the basic aim is the same in both subjects: to craft developmentally sound sequences of instruction across the grades and to coordinate instructional efforts across subject areas in ways that develop high levels of reading comprehension, writing, and mathematical problem solving. This complex instruction, this instructional work, is difficult to choreograph. And what makes this really difficult is the fact that children come to school at all different skill levels. And the variation in their many diverse needs is challenging to systematically assess, to track, to problem solve, to plan for, and to effectively address. Also, teachers vary greatly in their skills in delivering this kind of complex instruction. So how do we organize a school that can help teachers do this very hard work beginning right when kids start school? The designers of the University of Chicago model took on the task of organizing their school to reliably implement this developmental model of instruction. As Lisa explained, we spent some time observing and interviewing practitioners to document the model of instruction between the years of 2008 and 2012. So what did we find? We observed three key imperatives for the model. First, at the heart of the model was a systematic focus on providing each children with developmentally focused, ambitious instruction from the get-go. How was this different than the private autonomous model we often see implemented in school? So in the private autonomous model, we often see great variability in teachers' goals and their everyday practices in their classrooms. Something different is happening often in each classroom. In contrast, in the shared systematic model, we observed a high degree of alignment around a common goal of immersing all children in ambitious learning right from the very first day of schooling. Also in the private autonomous model, teachers typically use some common materials, maybe like a basal or a shared math text. However, when they're using these resources in their classroom, they're accessing them in highly variable ways based on their individual skills and how they decide to organize their instruction in their classroom. In the shared systematic model we observed at UCCS, teachers shared the same ambitious curricular framework, and they participated in the same shared systematic collection and use of formative assessment data. Teachers also gained expertise in the particular curricular framework and in the assessment tools that undergirded the framework. The second imperative was organizing teachers' work to provide ambitious instruction. So how is this different? In the private autonomous model, we often find traditional norms of privacy, autonomy, and egalitarianism. As Lisa said, she described this well for us earlier in the presentation. In contrast, the shared systematic model involved new norms of shared public practice, where everyday student progress was common knowledge across the entire school staff and regularly shared with parents. The private autonomous model this avoidance of critical dialogue about teacher practice was very different than the shared systematic model, which was this ongoing, close analysis of teacher practice linked to student learning. In the private autonomous model, we see sporadic external teacher professional development, perhaps outside workshops, whereas in the shared systematic model, we saw ongoing pedagogical guidance for teachers about their everyday practices, often given by coaches in their classrooms, watching them do their instruction and face these different kinds of problems and work through them with them and coach them right there in the moment. That's a very different kind of professional development. So also in the private autonomous model, we see this flat career trajectory for teachers. Sort of they're progressed by their years in the field. What we saw in the shared systematic system was new leadership roles for teachers, with monetary incentives for teachers who were experts in this shared instructional system. In the private autonomous model, we see school leaders as operational managers, whereas in the shared systematic model, school leaders are instructional experts. They're responsible for each child's academic outcome, and they're capable of providing the instructional leadership that is needed to get all teachers on board and aligned with the instructional mission of the school. The third imperative was providing broader supports for the ambitious instruction. So in the private autonomous model, we see supports for individual teachers. They might make requests for something they need in their classroom. These can be very idiosyncratic. Even teachers might even compete with one another for resources and attention that they need to make their classrooms work. In the shared systematic model, we saw something different. We saw supports for the systematic monitoring of all students, and they were these need-based assessment of what students, how they were performing, and it was all public knowledge. And school leaders were taking inventories of needs and resources and distributing resources comprehensively and in close consultation with teachers, coaches, and other school leaders. The private autonomous model suggests separate services for qualified students, sort of the special ed track, whereas in the shared systematic model, we saw integrated services for all students. And finally, in the private autonomous model, we see we often see a case-by-case sort of scheduled parent engagement, or maybe even a crisis, put out the fire approach to parents. But in the shared systematic model, we saw continuous parent engagement and a really strong focus on child learning. So this is a very brief overview of what we talk about in the book, and Steve is going to take us through the results that tell us the impact.
Okay, so let's talk about the impact then of this model on kids' learning. And I should give credit to Daniel Schwartz, who's a wonderful student in statistics at Chicago, who's helped us on this chapter. And then I'll say a little bit about the final chapter, which is the role of the university in school improvement. We think we've learned something about that. So the question of impact. So what was the impact of attending the charter school on reading and math achievement in these years where we did the research, 2008 through 2012? And what are the implications of these results for educational inequality? So we have a very nice design to evaluate the impact of the school. In each year, in each of the 2 campuses, for each grade, there's a lottery. So parents come in the spring of the year, and they sign up to have their kids be enrolled for whatever grade their child is in. And typically, these lotteries these applications are oversubscribed. There are more people than there are places. And so using a table of random numbers, parents are offered a place, or if their number doesn't come up, they're put on the waiting list. So we'll call the people who are offered a place in the school the lottery winners, and those who are offered it, who are put on the waiting list, the lottery losers. It's a little bit complicated to get this right because statistically, because parents have different preferences. Some parents preferred what we call the North Kenwood Oakland School, which is a little bit nearer the university, but nevertheless in a segregated all-black neighborhood. And the other school is further away in a somewhat poorer neighborhood. And so some parents, and that's the Donahue School, so some parents would prefer one school. If their child didn't get into the NKO, they didn't want their child to go, or maybe the Donahue, or they would prefer either one, that the people who would take either school had a bigger probability of winning, because if their number came up and one of the schools was full, they still had an option. So we had to take that into account. We had to take the year that the parent applied into account, the age of the child, and then there were some priorities. And don't want to get too deeply into the details, but just to give you some sense that even though it's a randomized experiment, we have two statistically equivalent groups. To make it really work, we have to be very careful about some of these priorities. For example, if you had a sibling in the school, you were given priority. If you lived near the more low-income school, you had a geographic preference. And so there were separate lotteries. So as a result, we end up with, and you don't have to know all the details in this, but we end up with 23 separate randomized experiments, small trials, in which, so for example, in 2005, we can see that 54 people applied for the lottery, 44 lost, and 10 won. Those kids then were tested. We followed them until they were tested in third grade, and then every other year that they were tested. So really our job is to synthesize, if you're interested in hierarchical linear models, 23 separate randomized experiments. But the beauty of this, of course, is that we have these statistically equivalent groups. And that means that we don't have to worry about the usual kinds of selection bias that we see in a lot of school evaluations. So what are the major findings? Well, then the first major finding is that, actually, the second one listed here, which is we see, the first major finding is that the kids who won the lottery and thereby were able to attend the school made very large gains in reading and mathematics. And as a result, we can trace the impact of this on the gap between these kids, who are all African-American kids, and white kids in Chicago. And it's a very large reduction in racial inequality. The second major finding is that we see unusually large gaps, large impacts in reading. And I'm going to say something more about why we think that's a little bit unusual. There are a few counterexamples, such as in Success for All, where we see large effects in reading, but in many other studies we don't. And thirdly, and importantly, the effects that the kids experience in elementary school don't fade when they go to middle school. So we see, I'm sure if you follow the intervention research, you'll see that in many intervention studies where there's a special intervention, you'll see that kids have a benefit in the short run, but when they move on to some other setting, the effects go away, and in this case they don't. And in fact, there's some evidence that they actually increase after the kids leave, and we'll say something about that. So this is just a graphical result of the effects of just the effects of literally winning versus losing the lottery. So the black bars in grades 3, 4, 5, and middle school are the average achievement of kids who won the lottery, whose number came up, and the gray bars are the average effects of those kids who lost the lottery. And we can see that these are very large gaps. These are gaps of about 30% of a standard deviation on average for the first 3 grades. And then during the middle school grades of 6, 7, and 8, we pooled them together because the numbers are smaller. The effects are actually larger. Now, it's a little bit complicated because not everybody who wins the lottery attends the school. And not everybody who loses the lottery doesn't. So some of the people put on the waiting list show up in the school, and some of the people who are offered a place in the school don't attend. So that means that the graph that you're looking at right now actually underestimates the impact of the school, because the black bar includes kids who never attended the school, and the gray bar actually includes a few who did. So we have some very useful methods statistically, using what we call instrumental variables, to identify the impact of attending the school on those whose behavior was affected by the lottery. So those who were induced to take up the school by virtue of winning the lottery versus how those same children would have done had they not won the lottery. And that result is described in this graph. The blue distribution is our sense of where the kids where the kids are who lost the lottery and as a result were unable to attend the school. And I'll say that they're not as low scoring as the average black child in Chicago. They're a little bit higher, achieving on average, but they're actually still about 2/3 of a standard deviation behind the average white child in Chicago, and that's the yellow bar, the one that's furthest to the right. The green bar, the green graph, is the achievement distribution of those children who won the lottery and as a result were able to attend. And so the distance moved from purple to yellow is the closing of the black-white achievement gap in Chicago. And to make this very clear, the kids who lost the lottery and therefore were unable to attend would have scored on average about at the 26th percentile of the white distributions. That means that about 74% of the white kids in Chicago would outscore those kids. Whereas the green bar, these are now the kids who won the lottery and therefore were able to attend the school, on average scored at the 44th percentile of the white distribution, which means that they're very close to where you would expect white kids in Chicago to be. And by the way, white kids in Chicago nowadays are a relatively advantaged group, which did not used to be the case. So what we really see then on average, and this is averaging between reading and math because the results are very similar, is that we see that a big piece of the black-white achievement gap in Chicago is reduced for these children. So why are the effects, these big effects on reading, these are bigger than we see in most effective school research? Why is this such a surprise? And it has to do with what Elizabeth said, that inequality in reading has early roots in language development, early roots in what's happening at home that make it sort of hard for schools to overcome. And so what we see is that these schools, by using the model that my colleagues have described, have put an enormous amount of effort into literacy instruction, into basic skills, but also into higher order thinking, and also pretty much doubled the amount of instructional time. So instructional time becomes very important. I'm out of time. I do want to say that I did want to mention that the fact that the kids did really well after they left the school in middle school, and in fact that the effects actually increased, is partly because we think they were well prepared for secondary school, but also because the school counseled the kids to go to the very best matching middle school that they could attend. So this is something else that schools can do, is helping kids make the next transition, whatever that might be. And since I'm out of time, I can't say anything about the last point, which is why we think universities have a tremendous role to play in school improvement. We don't think universities are playing that role, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that during the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to, okay, well, I'm assuming the tech guys can fix the slides. So I want to invite up the authors, or Steve, to come up here, and at the same time, our panelists. And let me introduce them to you before I join them on the panel for some Q&A. Again, we have three fantastic panelists. McGhee Hassrick is the founder and CEO of Digital Pioneers Academy, which is a charter school that will open this fall in D.C. Congratulations, McGhee, on your charter approval. We also have Principal Melissa Brunson from Cloverly Elementary School, who I will again thank you for coming out after the end of a full day of school leadership. Melissa is not only the principal at Cloverly, she's also the vice president of the elementary chapter and a board member of the Montgomery County Association of Administrators and Principals, and is an adjunct professor at Howard County Community College. So thank you for being here, Melissa. And finally, we have Bob Slavin from Johns Hopkins University. Bob is the director of the Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins, and he's also the chairman of the Success for All Foundation. Many of you are familiar with Success for All, Whole School Reform. Bob has authored, this can't be right, Bob, it says 300 articles and book chapters and 24 books. He's done some writing in his time. He's been appointed to the National Academy of Education, AERA Fellow in 2010. I'm sure dozens of other things that we don't have time for. Bob, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. So I'm going to join you here. And I'm going to give all the panelists a few minutes to just sort of give their reactions to the book and the presentation. And McGhee, can we start with you?
Sure. Well, Nat, thanks for having me. It's McGhee like paper mache, and I would not be here if my school was opening this fall. It's actually opening up next fall. We just got approved this past May, so we are incredibly excited about that. So thank you. I was like, oh no, not this fall.
Fever dream.
You know, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Digital Pioneers Academy and how it just reaffirms that everything you just said is that we're on the right path. So thank you for your comments and your history. And I don't know, Jen Volin told me to come today, so I'm here, but I don't think she actually knew that I was in Chicago from 2000 to 2004, and I had visited North Kenwood, Oakland, because I worked at Leadership for Quality Education, which was a charter school resource center. So this is really a full circle moment for me. I had been a special education teacher in Williamsburg, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., and my mentor teacher said to me one day that one of my students, Nicholas, who I thought was just incredibly smart and passionate and bright-eyed, and they used to call him the frequent flyer, which meant he was frequently in trouble, very much like the students that you talked about in the south side of Chicago. And my mentor teacher said to me, well, don't worry about Nicholas, he's just gonna wind up in jail. And I thought, what? You're supposed to be helping me figure this out. That wasn't particularly inspirational. And that really, honestly, got me on the path to figuring out how do we do this? How do we make sure that we serve all students, that we have high expectations for student outcomes? And that's actually where I found the Charter School Resource Center in Chicago. And I actually do really remember walking to the North Kenwood Oakland School, and the most immediate thing that came to mind was the culture. It was clearly a culture led by teachers who wanted to collaborate and wanted to work together to serve in the best interests of students. And literally this is in 2000. And so to be here now in 2017 and to knowing it is about great teaching, but teachers working together in a collaborative, professional way. I do have to remind folks that at this time, in early 2000, it was like the post-NCLB era. And so if you think about, I used to say the pre-NCLB era is everything you described on the, I think you call it the rigorous, not the way it should be done, that's it. Yes, the autonomous, is that excellent teaching happened in isolation. There really was, like when teachers were excellent, they did it because they were passionate and they closed their doors so that no one would bother them, which led to the inconsistency that happened. But really in a post-NCLB era, there was real accountability, accountability for all students, which meant the doors had to now become open. And I really think that is a huge part of this shift in terms of now you can be great, but we expect everyone to be great. So fast forward, 3 things that you all said in terms of Digital Pioneers Academy. We're going to be a middle school that serves all students in Southeast Washington, D.C., focus on computer science, which for me is connected to rigorous content, rigorous curriculum. We have to have high expectations for all students. The second is we're a semi-self-contained model, so 2 teachers, very elementary, but in a middle school context. That's about relationships, both relationships with students, but really an opportunity for teachers to to work together in terms of curriculum, to be able to differentiate, to provide students the supports they need. And then the last is really, again, just this culture of high expectations. How, when you create an environment where everyone believes and everyone has high expectations, and it's the idea of real choice in terms of autonomy to serve students at the local level, but in an environment of accountability. And so the last thing I'll say is the biggest thing in terms of this post-NCLB, this high accountability, I think is the role of the principal. And that is the role of the principal as instructional leader. And at Digital Pioneers, we will have an instructional leader who at least will spend 75% of their time in the classroom, working with teachers, working with students, providing those supports. And in this pre-NCLB era, you've got the principal who's literally putting out all the fires. They're the building manager, they're the operational manager, they're doing all of those things that take away from time to build the instructional expertise and capacity of teachers. Those are the things that we've learned. You've confirmed everything that we're trying to do, so I appreciate you telling the story and look forward to questions from the group.
Thank you, Michelle. Bob?
Well, thank you. This is, the book and this event really are very exciting developments. We face in this country a situation that is utterly unacceptable and that isn't getting any better. You could think of it as about 100,000 schools, 52% of which are Title I school-wide projects, and year after year after year, these schools are failing kids in very, very, very large numbers. And these kids in Title I school-wide projects in particular don't have a plan B. These are kids who really depend on the school, and if the school fails them, then they're headed for very big trouble. Your kid that somebody talked about, that well, he's just headed for jail. I wish that were the only kid that people felt that about, because there's so many that people feel as though they've given up on, or that they're never going to go anywhere, or what have you. This problem is not going to be solved one teacher at a time. It's not going to be solved by directives going out from Washington to change the rules, or to make minor changes, or even to spend more, without a clear sense of what we're spending more for. If it's going to be changed at all, it's going to be changed because we figure out how to reform schools as the unit of change, how to routinely produce schools in which success is the norm and failure is not tolerated. That these schools are not going to be exceptions with exceptional teachers sprinkled around. They're not going to be exceptions because they're exceptional schools sprinkled around. We're only going to truly make progress if we can turn around whole schools on a very large scale and understand what we're doing, so that we can have a system that routinely produces better outcomes and then produces a better system at the same time, so that in 5 or 10 years we're getting better outcomes than we did before. So this effort, it's going on in Chicago, is a new entry into this, into a number of things that have gone on over in past years, but very up to date and very appealing it's very appealing as a model. It's different from other things that people have done in whole school reform. It is a charter school, which makes it, one of the things that's been interesting is that there's this very big fight about, charters versus not charters, and very, 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 very little fight and very little interest in what people do inside those charters or the non-charters. And so, in essence, there's kind of a little bit of a school reform movement outside of charters, and then charters is an alternative to it. But the inside of charters, what do we do inside those schools, and how do we validate and prove that things we're doing in those charters are actually making a difference, is just really beginning. And this is a good example of how you can take the charter opportunity and make it into something, rather than expecting that the very fact that you plaster the word charter over the building is sufficient, because we know that it is not. So that's very, very good. The outcomes are wonderful. I'd be the last person in the world to lecture Steve Raudenbush about methodology in any way, whatever, but the ITT, the intent to treat outcomes are impressive enough. I'm not sure, I think that the CACE outcomes are a reach, let's put it that way. I mean, you can justify them if you like, but the ITT outcomes by themselves are really very impressive and really indicate what's possible at the level of schools, and provide a basis for greater optimism about what's possible on a broader scale if you can make this thing go. Now, I'm being told that I need to quit soon, but let me just quickly note a few things that were not, I thought, adequately dealt with, one of which I just implied. There's very little conversation, a little bit at the end, about scale. This is 2 schools. 2 important schools in Chicago, but it's 2 schools. That's not a big down payment on $100,000. I think that even if the model is scalable, I think it in principle could be, who would do that? It's not created in partnership with the kinds of folks who would be likely to want to go down that road. Right now, a lot of what's happening in terms of school reform has to do with the new ESSA law and the definitions in the ESSA law of proven programs. How does this contribute to that policy? If it doesn't, then it's a demonstration of something, and that's still valuable. But it would be useful to show that linkage, to show more clearly what the policy implications could be under the best of circumstances. So there's more I could go into, but by and large, I think this is a wonderful thing. I'm glad that it happened. I'm glad that you present it so clearly, and I hope it makes a difference. But in education, nothing makes a difference unless somebody sets out to cause it to make a difference at scale, because people don't just take good ideas and implement them. They have to be on board with something that they see as bigger than themselves, that they can really make a substantial difference. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thanks, Bob. Melissa?
I can assure you, I think I'll be brief, because to follow up on anything that they've said, particularly the administrator that you'll be taking on that school, is just pretty much an add-on. And so I work in Montgomery County. I've been a principal at my school. This is my 11th year there. And quite frankly, I have a pretty balanced, racially, ethnic balanced pretty school. When I first started at the school 11 years ago, we were close to 70% white, and it's pretty affluent, upper middle class. I wouldn't say they were at the very top of the Potomac, but definitely, upper middle class. And just over the years, things have changed. And so obviously, as we are making those changes, we have to change our practice. And it's very interesting when I hear some of the backlog of stories between these 2 schools, the tale of the 2 schools. I look at, principal leadership and the difference that it makes. When I hear things that, there's still that authoritative style in a school, it makes it very hard on teachers to really conduct their practice in the most appropriate ways that benefit students. And so that shocks me sometimes, but I had to consider the time frame too, because I mean, in no way, shape, or form should that style persist. As a matter of fact, I mean, I would say even as the last couple of years, even my style has changed so much more to be more of a collaborative style. And that collaborative style does lend itself to having teachers do more of sharing their practice. As an administrator, we're often taught early on that we're instructional leaders, and some people don't really know what that means. Okay, the title fits, it sounds good, we're managers and we're instructional leaders, that's my title, but do we truly do the work? And do we really create mindsets within our school building where people feel that comfortable to share their craft? One of the things that I'm going to add on to this conversation is around teachers feeling comfortable enough under our leadership to say, I don't know, to actually open up those classrooms, stop closing them, saying whatever we do behind closed doors, I remember that style, but actually opening them up and allowing folks in to coach us, observe us, provide us with feedback, and open opportunities for us to share pedagogical and practical solutions to some of the problems that we see in our schools. To actually do some of those shared approaches like looking at formative data, actually applying the assessments, looking at formatives that they've created, and sometimes, you know, you can flesh out which ones you want to use, and to actually come back and look at those data points and see what modifications need to be made in instruction so a child can improve. So again, like when I hear that old style still persists, it just shocks me, because in this day and age, after No Child Left Behind and all of the research, you know, we cannot allow us to be in just these little silos in how we behave and practice in our schools. So that's not going to work anymore. I can honestly say, like, some of the strategies, although, you know, we name things differently in different school districts and systems, so some of those shared approaches. So for example, we have something in our district called collaborative planning, and so teachers have the opportunity to actually come in and actually look at a lot of the curriculum and share resources. They actually have coaches right at the school, so our reading specialist was that literacy coach, it sounded like. And then we have our staff development, and that's sort of the basic sort of Montgomery County model for a basic school. Our Title I's have a little bit more, our focus schools have a little bit more. But those folks are there to help guide and lead and use a situational instructional model to make sure they're coaching, you know, teachers that have had veteran teachers and long lengths of practice to our basic who's very brand new and they need a little bit more of a directive approach to how they're applying instruction. So we do a lot of those things, and I definitely see the benefits, because when teachers own what they do and what they see and they work together, they have a tendency to want to own it as a group, and they see themselves as being part of the whole school and part of the whole, you know, the solving the problem around children who are struggling. And we are doing a lot to combat gap reductions, and what we look at is what we call an opportunity line, like opportunity gaps, because anytime that we're failing children, and again, we own that. If we're failing children, we're robbing them of opportunities. So I would say, even at a leadership standpoint, we have to change the mindset that these are our children, we own them, we earn every single one of them, and obviously in public schooling, there's no lottery process. Everyone has to come into our doors, and we have to plan for them. So I have to tell you, there are a couple things that I'm interested in, just so you know. I am interested in learning a little bit more about collaboration between principals, because that's important. I mean, teachers, that's that I don't know. Principals, I don't know, exists for us too. There are things that we need to know to lead better. So if we're in that authoritative teaching style, I mean, come on. We need to learn, what does it look like to be a collaborative leader? There was a second part, now I forgot it. All right, my time is practically about saved by the bell.
Well, we have some time for questions.
Okay, we'll
so
just leave it for
you
the
may
question.
you may get a chance to come back
Okay.
around to it. Steve, I wanted to ask about. Let me just say to the audience, the book there is no fluff in this book. There is no way to get through it quickly. It's readably written, but there's just no way to get through the fullness of the model. So I really do encourage you to read the book. One thing that didn't get a lot of attention was how shot through the school organization the students' assessments were. And that's not simply sort of math and reading assessments, but it's also their full special needs. all from their particular needs, not special needs. Not just for the teachers and the instructional coaches and the school leaders, but down to the extended day personnel and so forth. So can you just talk a little bit more about how information was managed and passed through the faculty at the schools?
Yeah, right. That's a really good point, because if you think about what it means to care about children and pay attention to children, there's an emotional side to that. But there's a data side to that, which is knowing where every single child is and knowing whether what you're doing is working. And I think that's probably the hallmark of this school. And how you can organize that is very challenging, because, for example, in reading, there's this thing called the STEP assessment that we describe in detail in the reading chapter, which teachers administer individually for each child. And there's a plan after each assessment. First of all, there's a statement of what step you're on, exactly where are you in the progression of reading, and what step should you be on in 10 weeks, and what's the plan to get there. And there's actually a formal plan to do that. And the parents also know what the plan is, and they're told what, the parents they discuss with the parents what you can do to help your child make it to that next step. Well, that is a whole organizational problem with that. Because when that teacher is assessing these children, somebody else has to be teaching that class. So you've got to have some organizational flexibility to have one of the literacy coaches, or the principal, actually, the director of the school, doing the teaching. And that way the director would say, that way I get to know the children really well. And so then there has to be teachers' time to plan what the instruction is going to be. So there's a group planning session for each child. There's an instructional plan. So that means the teachers have to be able to meet. They actually have to have a place to meet. They have an office. They have a time after school to do that. So these are really a lot of organizational. So if we say we really care about individual children, and then what are the organizational entailments of actually making that happen? You principals know that how carefully you have to organize. And you're calling on people also, the kids and the teachers, to do a lot of work. But if, sort of in an environment that's pervaded by this idea that we can do it. So I'm not sure it quite gets you there. But I could say something similar about what we call the social support system, which is almost like, instead of having an IEP for kids who are causing trouble in the classroom, it's more like assessing every child and knowing what are the social developmental needs of that specific child. And there's a similar thing going on in math. So it's very labor intensive, and it requires a kind of leadership that not just involves the principal, but it involves teacher leaders and pervades the school. So.
Bob, I'm interested in your sort of reaction to this, but also in the aspect of the challenge of turning around existing organizations vis-a-vis creating a new one. Those are two very separate things, and you have some experience in this. But it seems like this is a fundamental shift for some schools, as described in the book. And part of the reason, I believe, in the book that you went with some charters to describe this was because Tony Bright worked so hard to turn around some schools and felt like the traction there was, it was very hard to work against the ingrained sort of habits of mind and so forth. Can you just speak to the challenge in reorganizing a school as opposed to establishing this from scratch?
Well, in a way, there are challenges either way. There are some things you solve by starting with a school brand new, and there's some problems that you create. And I think people who are honest would admit that is the case. A school where the school has been operating for a while, people know each other, they trust each other, they have some experience and are there for a reason, can be a wonderful place to start, because they're not starting from zero. And I think, some charters end up, some charter founders will tell you, I didn't realize how much there was about lunch, or about transportation, or about, they're spending a lot of time on a lot of things that are not core to the instructional task, and we don't have a national lunch problem or a national transportation problem. You have a national achievement problem. And so, in a way it can be distracting, but at the same time, it does allow you to start from scratch and to do some things differently that could be hard otherwise. One thing we do as kind of an in-between in-between solution is that we require, when school wants to be a success for all school, we require them to vote by secret ballot, and that at least 80% of the teachers, plus the principal, have to want to do it. And I think in a sense, when a whole staff like that wants to do something, you can find solutions. And in a way, we worked in many, many, many highly unionized, rule-bound, kinds of places, and they say, and they say, no, the union's not going to let you do that. We go to the union and say, 80% of the teachers voted for it, and they say, dang, really? They don't vote for anything, including Chicago, by the way. But it's a way to get some running room without having to burn the place down and start a new one. That is at least worth considering. And it's so much easier to scale up, to be honest, because you're not trying to build whole new schools and deal with all the issues that taking on an existing school don't require you to do.
Yeah. I want to tell the audience I'm going to take your questions in just a moment. I'm going to get one last one in on my own, and also if you'd like to tweet some at me, I'll try and bring those in as well. But Steve, I wanted to return to the last thing that you wanted to mention and give you a brief moment to talk about the potential for higher education institutions to help schools and to sort of blend that research practice. And so just give you a moment to put something in.
What we tried to do in the book is to describe this school in enough detail so that someone could understand not only the theory, but actually the practice and how the pieces are put together. And we do think that's relevant to scaling, understanding how to make something happen. But we think that knowledge is a big part of making school, increasing our knowledge is a big part of making schools work and scaling. In other words, NCLB was good at motivating people and spotlighting on kids who hadn't been served well by the system. And people have fought for resources for schools, so resources and incentives are good, and we want to have high expectations, but we have to know how to create conditions in which the children can fulfill those expectations so they can be supported. In other words, it's when there's nothing better with working with young people knowing that somebody is actually achieving, and then that's reinforcing the high expectations. How you put the organization together, how you put the instruction together to make that happen in reading and math, that's not a simple problem. And schooling isn't that much more simple than medicine if you think about it. You have to assess doctors assess their patients, and then they prescribe the treatment, and there's a knowledge base there. Teachers have to assess, and then they have to instruct, but they've got to do it for 25 kids simultaneously in a classroom. That's a very complex problem of practice, and how you make that work well throughout in every room of a school, as Bob knows well in working with hundreds of schools in Success for All. There's a lot of that we need to learn and know how to do and write down. And great practitioners, and there are we have so many wonderful practitioners we got so many ideas from. They're not paid to write down what they know. So one of the ways in which universities and practitioners can collaborate is to make more visible and coherent what a lot of people already know so that more people can benefit from it.
All right, I want to open it up to the crew. We have two quick rules before you ask any questions. The first is please identify yourself with your name and affiliation, and then ask a question. If you don't ask a question, we'll move on to someone who has one. So here in the back.
Thank you. I'm Patrick Lenahan from George Mason University. I've got a question for you, Stephen. On your 23 different randomized control tests that you got, did you notice anything that students who were in the programs for a longer period of time had bigger impacts? In other words, somebody who may have entered your school at grade 3, by the time they got into 5th or 6th grade, they had a larger impact than somebody who just entered in 5th grade, who came in 5th grade, or did you have the study designed like that?
Yeah, it's hard to, we don't have enough statistical power to say that. Most of the kids actually came in either through pre-K or K, and the reason is that when you apply for 2nd, 3rd, or 4th grade, lots of people apply, but there aren't very many places, so we don't get very many lottery winners, and we just don't, I mean, that's a really interesting point. One thing we do know is the kids who come in later are further behind. So these are kids who are trying to get out of a school that perhaps they were having a hard time in. So now they're seeking a new school. They're moving into a charter school because the regular public school wasn't working for them. We know that. We know they're more disadvantaged, but we don't know that they don't benefit as much. We just don't know that.
I'm Roberta Stanley, and I'm with the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues and a former administrator with the Michigan Department of Education. I have 2 quick governance issues and a cultural issue. The first governance issue would be, what in the framework of the Illinois Charter School Law is most helpful in letting this school be successful? Secondly would be, does the University of Chicago subsidize the per pupil expenditure for the school? And lastly, a lot of cities in the United States, and I know Detroit better than Chicago, have a very serious mobility problem with families. Is that an issue in Chicago?
Yeah, I've studied that, actually, that issue. It is a really huge problem in Chicago. But going back to Illinois, so one thing is that Illinois mandates that unless you get a special, some kind of clearance for some kind of priority, that, that charter school spots should be decided by a lottery. That's very helpful for us methodologically. Second, they allow the City of Chicago, the CPS, to actually create lotteries. So the lotteries are actually created by the Chicago Public School Department. So they are regular public schools. However, the funding that comes to the school, charter schools, is actually, funding is a really hard thing to get your hand around, depending how you know, I'm sure you know how you define it and so forth. It's very difficult. But the funding that comes from the city is less than what would go to a regular public school. And yeah. There's a state allotment, but Illinois is very backward in terms of school finance. Most of the, it's great, huge variability from district to district on how school funding is done, and Chicago is actually very low. And so we do subsidize, and we talk about in the book that something like around $2,000 we do raise money to yeah, about that much. But still, that puts us below. It puts us below Washington, New York, Boston, most large urban districts. Philadelphia is another one that's very low funded, by the way.
What about the accountability aspects of the charter school?
They are because they are regular Chicago public schools. They are held to exactly the same accountability regime as all the regular other public schools, and they have the same publicly available school quality indices, et cetera.
Steve, well, we go to the next question. Just a quick question about the in-kind resources that come to the school, both for just technical assistance from University of Chicago and so forth. Were those substantial?
I would say so, and it's very hard to quantify. But so the assessment system for reading was developed by Tony Breik and David Kerbo at the University of Chicago and validated. So that's something that a typical school wouldn't have. By the way, that assessment system is now being used in many hundreds of schools across the country. The textbook, which is used as Everyday Math, which is actually University of Chicago School Mathematics Project, and the coaches are people who work on that project. So there's a lot of, what we have in the final chapter, we talk about the infrastructure that's available for schools to learn from each other, and from something that might be thought of as a district or maybe a charter management organization, and how crucial that is. And so they have a lot of, I would say that our schools have a lot of infrastructure because the University of Chicago is engaged. But this is another reason why we need to get more universities engaged, because there's a lot of potential for universities to help with this infrastructure.
I want to make sure that other panelists just jump in. If you have something to say, don't hold back.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Cal Smith with the American Federation of Teachers Educational Issues Department. And I also teach K-2 students with social and emotional challenges. My question is for Steve. Steve, you mentioned that the lottery losers at your school outperform the average black student in Chicago. I would accredit this largely to parental involvement and the fact that if you have parents that are willing to go through the application process to go to a charter school, they're also more likely to read with their children and have the resources at home to provide educational opportunities in the home. If your school model was forced to accept an entire school catchment area or an entire school district, would you see the same results? And if you were forced to take every student within a district, how would you provide these extra resources to the students most in need?
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't know that it's true that the parents are different in the ways that you say they may be. It's also quite possible that the small difference between black kids who who apply for the charter and in Chicago is because they're not drawn from the most deeply disadvantaged neighborhoods in Chicago. So, I mean, these are really great questions. We really need to figure out how to serve whoever we serve the best. But I do want to just point out that these kids are 85% low-income kids who are otherwise 2/3 of a standard deviation behind the average white kid in Chicago. So we're talking about still a very substantial challenge. So yes, this book, but yeah, there are questions you're raising that we would have to, that we can't answer with our experience. We need to get in and do the same thing. But I mean, I think the basic idea is that paying close attention to the progress of every single child and taking responsibility for that and not blaming the parents, not blaming the neighborhoods, not saying that we can't educate these kids. This is our job as educators. And I would hope that this could happen in any kind of school, whether it's a public school, a charter school, or a unionized school.
I just want to add to that. I think what was in your presentation, which I think is really important, is that this should not be a charter versus traditional public school debate. Bob, you mentioned earlier, I think it's really, really important to just know how much of a problem this is in terms of the achievement gap and the opportunity gap. We have millions of students who are dropping out because they do not have access to a great education, they don't have access to a great teacher. So the problem is very real. And if you read any headlines out of Chicago, it's not that we actually know it works. So I applaud you for pulling this book together because I actually think we know it works. We have the data, there are best practices. This is not a charter versus traditional public school. To me, this is about the political will and courage to actually do what works, and to ask the question around what are the barriers to make sure that the things that we've learned in terms of best practices happen in both traditional public schools or charter schools, but it is really about how do we serve every student as an individual. And I think this is scalable, but there is no one best system. There's no one best answer that's going to meet the needs of every single one of our students. And I think if we actually can get past some of these kind of false debates in terms of, is it union staff? Is it charter staff? This is about great teaching that happens when you have great teachers who love learning, who love teaching, who work in partnerships with parents, work in partnership with the community to really meet the individual needs of students. And I know that sounds kumbaya, but I actually believe that, and I think if we could get past some of the labels, we'll actually be able to get to where we need to go for kids and families.
We have time for one more question. There's one right here, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sonia Park with the Diverse Charter Schools Coalition, and this is a question for McGhee and for Melissa. Listening to Steve talk about the in-kind supports that the university is able to provide their schools, have you thought or do you have established partnerships that could help you with the implementation of the work that you're doing, or no?
Interesting enough you would ask that question, because remember where I left off, I said I had one more question? That was the question. And you followed up immediately, because I do have a question about that, the whole partnership piece. I mean, while we have student teachers that come in, while we have maybe just very basic level interactions with some of our collegiate partners, I personally have not seen enough of that directly in my school and in my experience.
So, we were just approved, and we are really at the early stages of establishing those partnerships. What I would say, Sonia, who is my friend from many, many years ago, that we are starting with the students and families first. And so what I think my biggest lesson learned in terms of ed reform is that we actually can't do this to communities. We have to do it in partnership. And so if you listen to students and families, you'll understand their needs, their wants, and your dreams, and then we can establish the partnerships. One of the things that that our when I spoke to parents as I was designing Digital Pioneers Academy, is that they really wanted access to computer science education. Like, they understand that their child has to have access to the digital economy. And so for me, it was one, confirmation that there's a need, but now it's how do we engage students, family, and community into creating a school that actually meets their needs. And I think the partnerships will come if we actually listen to the students and families.
I'm afraid I have dozens more questions, but it's always a good event when you're left wanting. For those of you who are watching the live stream, you can continue the conversation on Twitter with hashtag Ambitious Elementary. And for those here, we have a wine and cheese reception where you may let your questions fly directly to our panelists. Let me thank Melissa and Bob and Michelle and Steve and everyone else for coming and attending. Thank you very much.